The clock struck 3:17 in the morning when the phone rang. A voice from across the sea, sharp as a blade, cut through the silence. 48 hours. That was the ultimatum. Restore contracts, reopen surveillance, reverse sovereignty, or face exile and humiliation. For a small, landlocked nation of 22 million souls, the order seemed absolute. Step down or be dragged down. Choose surrender or chaos. Yet in the stillness of that night, another choice was born. A choice to resist, to refuse, to remind the world that sovereignty is not a commodity for sale. This was not the story of a president alone. It was the story of a people standing at the edge of history, deciding whether their future would be dictated by foreign capitals or carved by their own hands. From the darkness of one ultimatum, a fire of dignity was lit. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe and keep watching, for the next few minutes may change how you read the map of Africa, because the countdown had just begun. The ultimatum did not come during daylight. It arrived under the cloak of night, when silence is heaviest and the mind is most vulnerable. At 3:17 in the morning, a foreign leader declared that the destiny of Burkina Faso would be decided within 48 hours. 2 days, no more. Restore mining concessions. Reopen intelligence pipelines. Reverse decisions made in the name of sovereignty. If not, exile or overthrow. In that moment, the weight of history pressed down on a single office in Ouagadougou. For decades, Africa had been told that contracts signed under pressure were irreversible, that resistance was dangerous, and that sovereignty was conditional. Now, a voice from Tel Aviv demanded submission once again, cloaked in the language of business but sharpened into the threat of regime change. The president did not reach for compromise. He reached for clarity. With a calm voice, he replied, "I do not negotiate with extortionists. I do not bow to bullies. I will not abandon my people because of foreign threats." Then he hung up. That click of disconnection was the true beginning of the 48-hour countdown. Within the hour, the palace corridor stirred. Security chiefs, defense ministers, and intelligence officers were summoned into a dimly lit council room. The air was heavy, not with fear, but with recognition. They were not debating a minor policy dispute. They were confronting an operation designed to topple a government. The recordings of the calls were placed on the table, Netanyahu's voice echoing across the room, demanding compliance. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. The defense minister was first to break it. "This is not a negotiation. It is regime change." The intelligence chief added grim confirmation. Satellite activity over Burkina Faso had spiked. Cyber intrusions traced back to foreign networks. Suspicious money transfers fueling unrest. The preparation had been long in the making. The ultimatum was only the final trigger. The question was no longer whether pressure would come, but how it would manifest. Economic sabotage, orchestrated protests, digital disinformation, every tool except open war. For a small, landlocked nation without nuclear weapons, without vast armies, the imbalance was stark. But sometimes resistance itself is the only power that matters. The president rose, walked to a wall-sized map of Burkina Faso, and placed his hand upon it. "We are outnumbered. We are outgunned. Yet we are not outwilled." They think this is still 1960, when African leaders bowed at the whistle of foreign masters. They think our people's trust counts for less than foreign approval. They are wrong. We will show them. The night stretched into dawn as the council debated options. One path meant safety, but dishonor, step down, hand power to a pliant successor, and hope for safe passage. The other meant storms ahead, stand firm, prepare for a hybrid war that would strike every institution, every screen, every bank account. There was no illusion of victory without cost. But there was also no illusion that surrender would save dignity. By sunrise, the choice was clear. Resistance would not be quiet. It would be deliberate, prepared, and visible. The first calls went out across continents, not for sympathy, but for solidarity. Caracas, Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, not as patrons, but as potential partners in a campaign of survival. Each answered differently, but the act itself was unprecedented. For the first time in decades, a threatened African leader did not retreat into silence. He built an alliance of defiance. As news of the ultimatum leaked, it spread like wildfire across radio stations and streets. What was meant to destabilize instead ignited fury. Crowds surged outside the palace gates, chanting in unison, "Our resources are not your property. Our leader stays. Our sovereignty is not for sale." Hand-painted signs appeared. 48 hours, try 48 years. The confrontation was no longer confined to a phone line between Ouagadougou and Tel Aviv. It had spilled into the public domain, into the hearts of ordinary citizens who had tasted the insult of being treated as pawns. The ultimatum was becoming a rallying cry. Yet as the clock ticked, the threat loomed larger. Networks buzzed with disinformation, whispers of bank accounts, staged videos of resignation, foreign analysts predicting collapse. Pressure mounted by the hour. Still within the palace, the line was held. Sovereignty over safety, dignity over ease. The 48 hours were not just about survival. They were about reclaiming the right to say no. But if the ultimatum had lit a fire inside Burkina Faso, the true storm was only beginning to gather. The hours that followed unfolded like the turning of an hourglass, each grain of sand marked by tension and defiance. By the 30th hour, the ultimatum was no longer confined to secret recordings. It had become a headline, a whisper on every street, a roar in every market. The people of Burkina Faso knew, and they were not silent. Crowds grew larger with each passing hour. Students carried placards declaring, "Surveillance is not security, it is submission." Traders shouted, "Our minerals are not for sale." Mothers with infants on their backs joined the chants, their voices cutting through the noise of rumor and fear. Far from demanding capitulation, the citizens demanded resistance. This was not panic. It was outrage turned into solidarity. Inside the palace, the phones never stopped ringing. From Caracas, Nicolás Maduro spoke words of solidarity, promising sanctuary if exile became inevitable. From Tehran, messages of cyber defense expertise flowed in, offering tools to counter digital warfare. Moscow extended hints of military advisors, while Beijing suggested alternative investment frameworks to replace Western withdrawal. Each call added a thread to a growing web of resistance, fragile, uncertain, but real. Yet the greater support came not from foreign capitals, but from the streets of Ouagadougou. When disinformation spread, forged letters of resignation, fabricated bank records, the people themselves debunked them. Radio hosts exposed fake news within minutes. Students used social media to counter falsehoods in real time. Citizens were not passive recipients of propaganda. They became active guardians of their own narrative. At hour 30, Netanyahu called again. His voice carried both menace and condescension. 18 hours remain. Do not sacrifice your people for your pride. The president's reply was measured but immovable. You do not understand what you face. You are not fighting me. You are confronting 22 million Burkinabe who have chosen dignity over submission. You forgot to ask my people if they wanted another leader. They have already answered. That exchange traveled faster than satellites. By noon, African capitals echoed with debate. Mali's president declared openly, if they can remove him, they can remove any of us. Niger's parliament passed a resolution condemning interference. Ghana called for an emergency African Union session. Chad placed its forces on alert. What began as an ultimatum to a single leader was fast becoming a continental crisis. Hour 36 brought the harshest blows. Banking systems staggered under cyber assault. Power grids faltered. Communications were jammed. Disinformation campaigns painted Burkina Faso as unstable, authoritarian, already collapsed. International headlines recycled the same words. Democratic backsliding. Dangerous precedent. African authoritarianism rising. Yet within the palace, backup systems clicked into place. Distributed generators lit hospitals. Encrypted lines kept leaders connected. Counter-propaganda networks exposed every forgery. The defense minister watching the storm unfold murmured, "They are not just attacking you. They are attacking African independence itself." And the world was watching. News reports speculated on collapse, while in African cafes, conversations turned to something else. Unity. A question began to take root. If one small nation could resist, why not others? If ultimatums could be defied, why had they not done so sooner? Hour 40 brought an unprecedented development. African leaders, not Western envoys, filled the phone lines. Support was no longer whispered. It was declared. An attack on Burkina Faso's sovereignty is an attack on all of us, announced Ghana. Any foreign intervention will trigger continental sanctions, warned Niger. For decades, African summits had been marked by polite speeches and cautious diplomacy. Now raw urgency united them. By hour 42, the ultimatum had transformed. It was no longer a bilateral standoff between Ouagadougou and Tel Aviv. It was a continental test of dignity. The pressure intended to isolate Burkina Faso was instead weaving Africa into a tapestry of shared resistance. Hour 45. Only 3 hours remained. Netanyahu's tone shifted. Gone was the commanding certainty. In its place, bargaining. Perhaps a diplomatic solution. Perhaps not resignation, only restoration of contracts. The president's reply was resolute. 3 hours ago, you might have had a negotiating partner, but you threatened democracy itself. We want nothing from you but recognition of our sovereignty. As the final grains of sand slipped through the glass, the world braced. Would the president step down? Would chaos engulf the nation? Or would something entirely different emerge from the crucible of 48 hours? When the deadline expired, the world discovered that ultimatums can be broken. When the 48 hours expired, the air above Ouagadougou trembled with voices. Tens of thousands filled the avenues, their chants drowning out every broadcast of foreign pundits predicting collapse. The ultimatum had ended, but its aftershocks were only beginning. The first tremors were felt in the economy. Banking systems, though bruised by cyberattacks, had survived. Yet international investors began withdrawing, citing instability. Western firms froze projects, and headlines warned of economic isolation. For ordinary citizens, this meant uncertainty, fuel shortages, fluctuating food prices, and a tightening of cash flows. But instead of despair, something unexpected happened. Communities reorganized. Local cooperatives sprang up to fill the gaps. Farmers pooled harvests. Traders built informal credit networks. What should have been a breakdown became the seed of resilience. Politically, the ultimatum had redrawn the landscape. The president's refusal to bow transformed him from a contested leader into a symbol. Opponents who once criticized his rule now stood behind him, for the attack was not on one man, but on the sovereignty of a nation. The phrase Traoré stays echoed not just in the streets, but in parliamentary halls. The ultimatum had given him what no campaign could buy: legitimacy born of resistance. The information war raged on. Forged letters, staged videos, fabricated corruption scandals flooded networks. Yet each time, citizens dismantled them with speed and precision. Young students became fact-checkers. Radio hosts turned into guardians of truth. In neighborhoods, debates flourished not about surrender, but about dignity. In resisting propaganda, the people discovered their own agency. Security services reported something chilling, yet galvanizing. Foreign operatives had funneled money to stir unrest, to manufacture protests demanding resignation. But the plan collapsed. The crowds were larger than expected, yes, but they were shouting the opposite. Instead of chanting for submission, they demanded sovereignty. It was the first time in decades that popular mobilization was not orchestrated by outside money, but born of indignation at outside pressure. The coup narrative was inverted. What foreign powers had intended as destabilization became, ironically, the moment Ibrahim Traoré solidified his place in history. Far from a weakness, the attempted coercion became a crucible. It was no longer framed as an Ibrahim Traoré coup engineered by external forces. It was reframed as a rejection of coups themselves, a choice for democratic endurance in the face of threats. The consequences stretched beyond borders. African Union delegates met in emergency session, condemning foreign ultimatums as illegitimate. Niger's parliament declared, if they remove him, none of us are safe. For the first time in years, the principle of non-interference was spoken with conviction rather than convenience. Inside Burkina Faso, the social fabric began to shift. Young people, once disillusioned, now spoke of politics with a new seriousness. If they tried to replace him without our consent, a student leader declared, then our votes truly matter. Civic organizations flourished, not because of international funding, but because citizens had tasted their own power. Yet the costs were real. Shops reported shortages. Inflation gnawed at households. Foreign aid was suspended. International media framed the defiance as isolationism. Still, when asked, citizens chose pride over pity. Better hunger with dignity than bread with chains, one trader remarked. The wider political scene in West Africa also shifted. Neighbors who had once distanced themselves from Burkina Faso now recognized their own vulnerability. The ultimatum had revealed an uncomfortable truth. Regime change by external diktat was not a relic of the past. It was a weapon still in use. And if one leader could face it down, others might too. The 48 hours had been meant to break the presidency. Instead, they forged a movement. Domestic legitimacy deepened, regional solidarity strengthened, and the idea of sovereignty, long eroded by conditional aid and foreign contracts, found new life in the hearts of citizens. Still, the storm clouds lingered. Economic pressure would tighten. Disinformation would not cease. Western powers would not simply retreat. The ultimatum had been repelled, but the battle for independence had only entered a new phase. If defiance had united Burkina Faso at home, the next question was whether the world would stand with it or against it. While the streets of Ouagadougou roared with chants of defiance, corridors of power thousands of kilometers away were filled with anxious whispers. The ultimatum, intended as a surgical strike against one presidency, had triggered a wave that no diplomat had anticipated. In Addis Ababa, the African Union convened an emergency session. The mood was unlike the cautious rhetoric of previous years. Delegates spoke with urgency, some with anger. If Burkina Faso is punished for defending its sovereignty, Ghana's representative warned, then none of us are safe. Niger's envoy echoed the sentiment, declaring that any attempt at foreign interference would be treated as an attack on the continent itself. For the first time since the independence era, solidarity was expressed not in abstract resolutions, but in the language of collective defense. ECOWAS, long divided by internal disagreements, found common ground in outrage. Leaders who had once criticized Traoré's military origins now praised his defiance. The message was simple. Today it is Ouagadougou, tomorrow it could be Abuja, Bamako, or Accra. Beyond Africa, reactions diverged sharply. European officials, alarmed by the optics of defiance, framed the resistance as democratic backsliding. Reports surfaced in Brussels about potential sanctions. Washington think tanks published papers warning of anti-Western realignment in West Africa. The United States government itself remained cautious, emphasizing concern for stability while avoiding open endorsement of ultimatums. Yet behind closed doors, analysts admitted the obvious. The threat had backfired, eroding rather than expanding Western leverage. Meanwhile, new alliances began to crystallize. Caracas offered political asylum, Tehran extended cyber expertise, Moscow floated military assistance. Beijing proposed economic lifelines. None of these offers alone could offset Western pressure, but together they formed a mosaic of alternatives. A new narrative emerged. Africa need not choose between submission or isolation. There was a third path, partnership on its own terms. The episode also ignited conversations across the global South. In Latin America, some leaders referenced the standoff as proof that resource nationalism could withstand external pressure. In Asia, commentators compared it to earlier struggles against colonial dictates. Across the developing world, the ultimatum became a case study in how threats could fail when met with unity. At the heart of this debate was a single phrase that began circulating in African media: Burkina Faso Revolution. It was not used in the sense of violent overthrow, but as shorthand for a shift in consciousness, the idea that sovereignty was no longer negotiable and that foreign approval was no longer the currency of legitimacy. International coverage remained divided. Western outlets emphasized risks of instability, while African networks celebrated resilience. But one fact was undeniable. The ultimatum had moved from a bilateral dispute to a continental manifesto. What was at stake was no longer a single presidency, but the dignity of an entire region. Yet even as Africa found its voice, the world still waited to see what future would Burkina Faso choose. The ultimatum had expired, but its echoes lingered like a drumbeat across the continent. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso had survived. It had. The question was what path lay ahead. Three possibilities loomed. The first was isolation. Foreign investors withdrawing, aid suspended, sanctions imposed. It was a path of economic hardship, where the burden of dignity would fall heavily on ordinary citizens. For some, this prospect seemed inevitable, the price of standing firm against a world order built on compliance. The second was confrontation, a cycle of hybrid attacks designed to weaken the state. Cyber sabotage, financial restrictions, and diplomatic pressure would intensify. Disinformation campaigns would seek to fracture unity from within. This was the battlefield of the future, not tanks on borders, but rumors on screens, contracts weaponized into shackles. Yet a third possibility glimmered with hope: transformation. In resisting the ultimatum, Burkina Faso had shown that sovereignty could be defended. That example had already sparked solidarity across Africa. If nurtured, it could evolve into a new model of cooperation, African economies trading with one another, African institutions funding their own development, African citizens seeing dignity as the foundation of governance. The path ahead would not be easy. Replacing foreign contracts with regional alternatives required time, skill, and trust. Building cyber resilience demanded resources and expertise. But the seed had been planted. And like any seed, it carried within it the promise of harvest. The president himself understood this. Addressing his advisors, he spoke plainly. We have rejected submission. Now we must prove that sovereignty can deliver prosperity. His words captured the essence of the challenge. Resistance alone could not sustain a nation. It had to be paired with reconstruction, with the creation of systems that made defiance not just symbolic, but sustainable. For citizens, the ultimatum became more than a political episode. It became a story passed in classrooms, sung in markets, whispered in homes. Parents told children, when they demanded surrender, we chose dignity. That memory, etched into collective consciousness, would shape a generation. The road stretched long before Burkina Faso, unpaved, uncertain, but illuminated by the fire of those 48 hours. Other nations watched closely, weighing their own futures against the same scales of submission and sovereignty. History would not remember the ultimatum itself, but what Africa chose to build in its aftermath. 48 hours were meant to decide the fate of a nation. Instead, they redefined the destiny of a continent. The ultimatum expired, but in its place rose something more enduring, a conviction that sovereignty is not granted by foreign powers, but claimed by the people themselves. In Ouagadougou, the crowds that once feared collapse became the guardians of a new narrative. They had seen that ultimatums could be refused, that intimidation could be resisted, that democracy was not theater but reality. Their chants, our leader stays, our resources are ours. Our sovereignty is not for sale, still echoed long after the deadline passed. The lesson stretched far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, leaders and citizens alike drew inspiration. They saw that one refusal could ripple outward, reshaping alliances, rewriting assumptions, and restoring dignity. The phrase Burkina Faso Revolution began to circulate, not as a tale of violence, but as a symbol of awakening, a reminder that dignity is not negotiable. And at the heart of it all stood a leader whose defiance turned a threat into a turning point. Twice his name was whispered in think tanks and headlines with the word coup attached. But history recorded something different. The so-called Ibrahim Traoré coup was not the fall of democracy, but the moment democracy was defended against coercion. This is why the story matters, because ultimatums will not end. They will come again, dressed in different words, carried by different voices. But their power lies only in acceptance. Refuse once, and their spell is broken. Submit once, and the chain tightens forever. For Burkina Faso, the ultimatum became a beginning rather than an end. It launched debates about trade over aid, about dignity over dependency, about partnership instead of pity. It lit a fire in young Africans who had once sought validation abroad, but now found pride at home. The world looked on, some with alarm, others with admiration. But for the Burkinabe, the meaning was clear. Sovereignty is not measured by military might or economic weight. It is measured by the courage to say no. And so the legacy of those 48 hours endures, a reminder that dignity can outlast threats, that democracy can survive pressure, and that ultimatums, no matter how powerful their senders, dissolve when a people refuse to accept them. They gave 48 hours to surrender. Burkina Faso gave history a lifetime to remember.